Looks like everyone's back for the most part. So I'll go ahead and get started. Oh, forgive my angry computer. I have my video off and everything. I think it just hates this, but it looks so nice. So, welcome to Redux. Redux is a state management library. Now, it is specifically a JavaScript state management library. And notice that I said JavaScript and not React. The thing with Redux is it works for any state management inside of JavaScript. It's not a library that is specific to React. So what we're going to build out today is going to be a pure Redux application. And tomorrow we're going to go over a React Redux application. There's some slight differences in the two, and I will go over them in detail. But for right now, we're just going to kind of concentrate on the Redux side. And then tomorrow we'll concentrate on how we get them to work together. So Redux is something that, again, you won't have a code challenge on. I would encourage you to do the labs. It's just another tool in your tool belt, and it will make a lot of your applications cleaner, easier to use, and faster. That being said, when I think of Redux, I would like you to remember and think of how difficult it was learning React, and how once you got to a point, you got it, right? It clicked, it made sense, and you got React from that point on. There was no like small increments. It's like going up a hill. It's hard until it's not. Redux is like that, except for it's much steeper hill. It's going for everything to work together, for your application to work, you need all the parts working together in a perfect cog machine. So if there's one part that's not working, and you don't understand one part completely, it's going to be hard to get any part of it working. So it's a lot of understanding the concepts and getting those into place and putting the puzzle pieces together before you see the whole picture. So it does take a learning curve. So if you're struggling with it, know that that is part of the process, and it will come with time. And once it does click, you got it. But it will. I don't want to scare you off from it. It's a great tool and you should use it. But do know that if you do struggle with it, it's okay. So let's talk a little bit about what it is. So the issue that Redux proposes to solve is a issue that we have with React. Have any of you, while passing state, lost it? When you're passing props down, suddenly just don't know. You're supposed to be passing props down from like this component, and it's not there, and you don't know why it's not there, and it was supposed to be there, and it's like 3 components up, and it's gone. Or like it's your state, your functions aren't exactly where you expected them to be. You're getting that error. This click handler is not a function, and you don't know why. You passed it up an app, but like it should be here. Where to go? I just have a feeling that you may have encountered that a couple times, at least once. The problem with React is, as great of a thing as that it is, passing props, passing state down through component to component gets a little hairy, even on small applications. On large 20-piece applications, it gets so difficult. In 100 component applications, it's like impossible. So Redux, here's kind of like a visual example of what happened. You pass things from a parent component to a child component to this child component. It's not great, not the best. But it works, right? You got it to work. It's a lot more convenient than some of the other ways you've handled state before. You don't know a better way yet. So I'm going to give you a better way of handling state. And that is going to be with the Redux store. Instead of ever having to pass through components again, define or trying to figure out does this form need state level component or component level state, or do I need to define state in app, or do I need to define it in this container component? Where does state go? You don't have to decide that anymore. Your state can now all go into a store, into one single place, one single source of truth where your state is kept, updated, and changed for the rest of the DOM. So it is essentially taking state outside of React and handling it in Redux. And now there's a special way that it does this, and it's it's in part an architecture idea. So it's not just this JavaScript library, it's also the way that you manage state and the way that you think about building an application. It's one that is carried over into other frameworks as well, because the idea of removing state into a store is super popular because no one likes passing state through components. So let's talk a little bit about what that architecture looks like. So you start with a store that holds your state. That store has access to methods that will take your state and update your view. One of those methods that we're going to talk about today is getState. So on load, if you are loading an application, if you're loading a page from your application, your store, you can call getState to your store, and it will take any state that's currently in your store that you want to be passed and use that to update your view. Now, on your view, you will have some type of handler, and you're going to utilize, instead of an event handler, something called a store.dispatch. This will take place of any handler that would have handled a bit of state. So any form submission, any on change, you will now handle that with a store.dispatch. What this does is this triggers something called an action. An action has two properties. It has a type and it has a payload. The type being the identifier of the action, telling Redux what this action is, and the payload being the data that you're carrying over. That enters something called a reducer that will update the store. So these are a lot of new words, but the cycle tends to be store, view, dispatch, action, reducer. And just kind of like this cycle over and over again. And do a little lightning to even kind of illustrate this. It's going to be a harder process to understand once we actually get into the code, but anytime you're lost, think to yourself, where am I in this cycle? Am I displaying things on the page or am I updating it? And we'll kind of talk about where we are in the cycle as we build this out. There are some principles that Redux follows. Single source of truth, everything's in the store now. Don't define component level state anyplace else. Unless you can still do form state if you really want to. I feel like that's still appropriate, but according to the principles of Redux, it's not. These are principles, not hard, fast rules that will break your application. State is read-only. This is something you should have been following in React in general. State should only ever be read-only. And changes are made with pure functions. Does anyone remember what a pure function is? Wheatley, I see you're nodding your head. Can you explain to us real fast what a pure function is?
It returns the same thing given the same input every time.
Perfect.
So it doesn't mutate.
Exactly. So like this is a function that will not have any side effects. It will return the same thing given the same input every single time. It's what you expect it to be. And I don't know why I made 3 copies of this slide, but I guess I did. I haven't looked at these slides for a second. But let's go ahead and hop into building out an application now. So the first application we're going to be making is a fairly simple one. Where is my Google? Here it is. I have so many things open. Let me move this here, bring this up here, and then close this here. As you can see, this is a very advanced application for counting numbers. You can add 1, you can minus some, you can even set the amount you'd like to add or subtract by. It's very advanced, I know. But we're going to build this out in Redux. Right now, this is built in a normal React app. Everything in here should be familiar. We start with a app component. We define state with a count, a value, and a message. We're not implementing message state right now. If we have time, we'll kind of talk about this. But for right now, we have the count and the value. The count being the number that is being added to. The value is the amount that is being added. We have 3 functions. One's to increase our count, one to decrease our count, and one to change the value of what's being added or subtracted. When we set state, we grab the state and we either add the value or we subtract the value. We are passing that down to our number component and our counter component. Our number component is keeping track of the value itself, and it is just a plain functional component here, and it accepts props, and it has the change value function here. The counter just has the increase and decrease here, and then it's displaying the count here. All this should be familiar at this point. Any questions about this app? Cool. So when using a Redux project, the first thing that you want to do is you want to install it or make sure it's installed. I have already gone ahead and installed it. If you wanted to install it, you would do npmi redux. That's all, and it will install it for you. Now, there's a couple changes that we have to make to our application in order to get it to sit with the Redux cycle of using the store to update the state. So the first thing that I'm going to do is inside of app, I'm going to build my store. I'm going to create my store. And I'm going to do that by importing Redux. So now, Redux has a function called create store. If that's not like self-explanatory enough, it is used to create the store. And we just bring that from Redux. We are going to use this create store. We're going to define it down here. This is about to break everything, so it's gonna be red for a while, just to warn you. We're gonna do const store equals create store. What this method takes, what this is going to require is something called a reducer. So we are going to, actually, sorry, let me take this out of here first. There we go. We're going to create a reducer. Right now, our reducer isn't going to say anything other than console log. So we'll do const reducer. This reducer is going to eventually take a piece of state and it's going to take an action. Remember, our actions are what triggers our update, and our reducers are what updates our store. So we're going to take this reducer and we're going to pass it to this create store. Now, this reducer, as I mentioned, needs a bit of state. So we are actually going to define an initial state above it. And this initial state is just going to be the state that we defined here originally. So we're going to delete this, instead put this here. This takes the state out of our app component and now puts it into the realm of Redux and something else we can control. Now, if I have state, and if I do not pass this reducer an initial state, I want this to use the initial state that I have defined up here. So this will be the default state. So at this point, we look at our handy dandy application. Oh, we need to start it. npm Am I in the right thing? No. npm run start. Perfect. Everything's angry. So we took state out, so everything's mad and going to be red for a while. So let's go ahead and take some of those things away. Since we don't have state defined, we can't really pass it anymore, right? So let's go ahead and remove state from here. And we'll remove state from here. which means we are going to need to remove state from these components as well. So we'll take the count out from these props, and we will take it out from this value out from our number component. Okay, so it's less mad, but has nothing. We lost our functionality. We have to do some stuff to bring that back. So at this point in our application, we have the store defined. We have it started. We are going to need our reducer to do some work for our store. So our reducer will eventually take our actions and update the store for us. But for right now, we need to get some things in here. So a reducer works off a number of cases. You can either, and conditions. You can either build this with a list of if conditions, but what I would recommend is doing a switch statement. What the switch statement is going to do is this switch statement will look at the action that is passed to this reducer. It will identify that action, and depending on what type of action it is, it will change and update the state. So for a switch statement, you start with the keyword switch. We pass it an action type. If you remember, actions have two variables or properties. It has the type and the parent payload. This is the identifier. And our switch is going to have several cases. For right now, we're going to put a default case. And that default case is going to return state. So I believe I don't have to put in the other cases as long as I have this in first. We'll see. So what this will do, because we have set initial state here, this reducer will return initial state and pass it to our store down here. So this is probably...
We're missing an I in initial.
Is it consistent at least?
Oh, it is consistent.
As long as it's consistently wrong, but I'll fix it. Yeah, that looks better. There we go. I think it should be illegal to have more than 2 of the same letter in any word. Just saying. Okay, cool. So we have our reducer kind of built. We have it passing to the store, so it now has the ability to update the store. But like, what are we going to do with this, right? How are we going to pass this the actions that it needs? In order to do that, and again, stick with me, I know this is a lot to see before you actually see anything work. We need to create our actions. We need to do an action creator. So our actions will take the place of these functions we have here. We will have an action that will cause an increase. We will have an action that causes a decrease, and we'll have an action that changes the value. So I am going to define those actions inside of our components that will trigger them. So that means we will no longer have to pass down any of this. Instead, we're just going to pass around actions. So inside of our counter component, I'm going to require in the store because we're going to need some things from it. Import. Now this has to be spelled right, even if it's consistent. We'll import the store. Now, when we're importing the store, we aren't importing it from Redux. We initialize the store inside of our application right here with our create store app. So in order to import it, we are importing it from app. And / and this capital. Now that we have access to our store, which again was initialized by Redux, means that we have access to everything inside of our Redux store and what Redux gave our store from initializing it, which means we have access to get state and we have access to dispatch. You remember my handy dandy slide deck that I have somehow lost. Let's see. Is it? That's zoom. Let me see. Yes, this is my slide deck. Wrong side. I really need not to have 50 million Google things open at once. Here we go. The two functions we need from the store in order to kick this off, in order to get this going, are going to be the store.getState, which updates the view, and the store.dispatch, which dispatches an action from our view. So, for updating it, this counter ID, this is the thing that displayed our image onto our browser in the first place. So this one is going to need the store.getState. So gonna need curlies. Oh. When we're saying store.getState here, we need to define what bit of state we want. And for this, I want the count. So let's see if this displays the count at all. We need to export the store. So I'm getting this import error because the store actually needs to be exported, which I just forgot to do. So instead of doing this export defaults, I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to put export here, or export and export here. Now, you can totally combine these and export them in a single variable like we did the other day, or you can just do it like this. I'm going to do it like this just because this app is very small. But since I did that, I'm going to need to put curlies around this app since it's no longer default. Which means inside of our counter, I did put curlies around here. Now this should make this less angry. And now that it's less angry, we have our count back. So let's take a pause here. What happened was our store.getState grabbed this method from the store that we imported from app. Inside of app, we had defined store down here, and we had created the store and passed it a reducer. Our reducer is returning our initial state by default. It's not doing anything else. All it's doing is it's returning our initial state, passing it to the store, so the store now has access to our state wherever we call it. Does that make sense?
Can you really quick go over what that switch and default is doing?
So for right now, let's go ahead and just get rid of the switch statement, and we'll bring it back in a second. I think this will still work. Yeah. So we're just going to return the state. This is all the reducer has to do right now.
Gotcha.
We can even take a look at what the state looks like. And the state is just the initial state that we passed it. So putting aside the switch statement, which we'll come back to, does this make sense? That kind of what's happening, that the store comes from this create store, which is from Redux, and this create store is a method that is passed a reducer that returns our initial state. Does that make sense? Cool. And then in order to call anything from our initial state, we need to use store.getState. Cool. Okay. I'm seeing some confused faces, so I'm holding for a second, but if I have no questions, I'll move on to the dispatch. All right, so for the dispatch, for our actions, we are going to need to define them here, because this is where our actions need to occur. This is where our events occurred. We have our prop.increase and decrease. I'm actually going to remove this props because we're no longer passing this down, right? So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to build out the increase handler. So I'm going to define it here. And I'm going to call it increase. I'm going to make it an arrow function. And from here, I'm going to call store.dispatch. Now, dispatch takes an action. And like I said, the action has two things in it. It has the type identifying what that is, and it has a payload. So it is a plain object. So we're just going to give it a type, and that type is going to be increase in all capital letters. Let's go ahead and remove this decrease for now and set it to null so it doesn't cause us issues later. Now, we're going to give this a payload for right now. And this payload can be anything. And we aren't actually going to make use of it quite yet. But for right now, we're going to set it to a string that says added curly interpolation. We're going to add store.getState.value. So what this will say, depending whatever value we have in store, is added 1, added 2, added 3, whatever that is. We're not going to make use of this quite yet, but for right now, that's what this action is going to hold. It's going to hold a type, and it's going to hold this payload. When this gets dispatch, it's going to be dispatched on a click, like any click handler that you had. On click, it will call increase, and increase will call store.dispatch, which will dispatch this action. This action will be dispatched to our reducer. Now, there is no hooking up that you have to do from our action to our reducers. Store.dispatch is what does that hookup for you. You don't have to import it. You don't have to do anything else with it. The store itself is taking that action and it's sending it to this reducer. And we can take a look at that by console logging action. All right, here is a plain action. And then let's see what happens when we hit add. Apparently nothing. Did I save this? I don't think I did. Okay. There's our action. Our action has a type of increase and a payload of added 1. So again, don't need to hook it up. Redux does that for you. This part is a little confusing sometimes. Is there anything about that that doesn't make sense?
So what in relation to React is being imported again into these files?
Redux.
Redux. Yeah.
So the store is being used here, and Redux is imported with the crate store. So the So the crate store is kind of like our key to Redux that gives us all of our Redux functionality, and so we create the store, and by creating the store, we have to pass it our reducer, and that is what hooks everything up. So because, it's basically because you're calling store.dispatch, because this is on the store that you passed this reducer to. That's how this knows that action goes to this reducer. Does that make sense?
Somewhat, yeah.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
Let me try to think of a good analogy for this. This is so much easier when it's in person because I have everyone stand up and like go in a circle and talk about this. But so
You can do that.
it's normally people pass candy and stuff, and then we have like things on the whiteboard. It's an entire thing. But I'll try to think of something a little bit more practical. So think about your store as being a post office, and your post office can receive letters and send them out. So between receiving the letters, that is going to be your action. Your action is pretty much your letters, your packages. Your letters and packages have an address on it, and it contains some content. It contains a letter, it contains crayons, it contains whatever you ordered off of Amazon or Etsy. That's its payload. The store, the post office, the person who changes state is like the postal worker, the person who receives the action, which can also be thought of as the reducer. They take the action, they read the address, and they decide what needs to happen with that letter or that package. But the only way that all of this is hooked up is because we are sending it to the post office, and the post office received a letter. Because it knows that it's that system, that's why it can interact. This only works if everything is touching the store. If the store is being passed this reducer, and if we are calling the methods from the store. So these aren't coming from anywhere. It's coming from the store that we're including in this app, from this app that we initialized here. And when we initialized it, we passed it this reducer. I feel like that made it worse. But here we are. So now that we have our action here, we need to do some things with it. And this, Colton, is where the switch statement is going to actually come in. So,
okay, because I was just about to ask what the action is as well.
So the action is what we just said here, right? So this is our event handler.
Yeah, I mean, like, not like what is it? I mean, like, what is the use of that? Like,
Yeah.
What is the purpose?
That's where, again, the switch statement is going to come in handy. So we're going to define our switch statement. We're going to pass it our action. And we're going to list our cases. Our first case is, of course, going to be the first action we dispatched, and that is going to be increase. Was it increase? I think it was increase. Yeah. If this reducer receives an action called increase, an action with a type of increase, it is going to do something to the state. It is going to return our state, and it is going to update it. It's going to update it with the value. So we're going to need to do return, capital return. This is essentially like your set state. We will make a copy of state with the spread operator, and we are going to select count, and inside count, we are going to grab state.count. Remember, this has access to state from here, and we're going to add a number. We're going to parse. Our number is going to be our state.value. We're going to have an issue with this a little bit later, but for right now, our state value is 1, so that works out. Now, if we don't have this case, if we aren't returning or updating this, we need a default statement inside of our switch case to return if we receive an action that is not in any of our cases. And that is why, and I had default return state here. So if our reducer is triggered by anything that it doesn't have a case for, it will just return the initial state. It won't update it, it'll just return it. So for this, I would like you to be able to see state. It's not going to update on the screen, but I want to see you to see it update when we hit this button. So I'm going to do console.log state, so we can take a look at it. All right, so state is, again, don't look here, it's happening here. State is actually updating every time we hit this. So when our action comes in, it triggers this. So that is the point of our actions. That is the point of our actions coming to this reducer. Does that make a little bit more sense of why we need our actions and what the switch statement is for?
Yeah.
Cool. Now that being said,
It's the
yeah.
type here is like to like the function name kind of.
So it's not a function name, it is a property on our action. So this is just a property on our action. Our action is a plain JavaScript object, and it has a type and a payload. So this is not a function. This is just an object that has an identifier and a payload of some sort. Right now, we're not doing anything with our payload. So just imagine this. We can actually just take this out for right now. We won't add that back in later. All this does is this says, I am whatever I got triggered by, this onClick triggered this increase action. When that increase action goes to app, it takes a look at it. It takes a look at the action type and sees that it's an increase, and then this is the function return. This is the functionality. So, does that make sense? I kind of just want to make sure that you understand the difference between those two things.
Yeah, and then increase is something that you just came up with, right? That's not like native.
No, we can name this like rows. Oh, all caps. This won't break if it's not all caps, but it's convention to do it all caps because it was written by someone who's not me. For reasons like in lower level languages, other than not JavaScript and Ruby, capitalized letters like this tend to mean the variable is a constant. So it is a something from that, but this won't technically break it. But whatever you name this type, this can be anything that you want, and it will still do its job as long as it can find it. So with it being named rows, it's still updating our count. Cool.
Great, thank you.
All right. So this is a lot. So I'm going to have you, in the best that you can, and if you can't, it's fine, walk me through doing the decrease functionality. It's going to be exactly as the increase functionality, but starting at count, on this onClick, how do I build my action to be dispatched?
You should define a constant called decrease.
Cool. I love it. And what do we want inside of here?
Store.dispatch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then what does this take?
It takes a type.
Okay, and what is that type part of? What is the thing that this object is?
It is a action.
Perfect. We'll do capital decrease. And then from here, where does this go?
To the reducer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then inside of here, let's go ahead and make another case. And this case will be decrease. So
I love switch statements.
Sorry, what was that?
Oh, I was saying I love switch statements.
Yeah, they're pretty.
I get excited every time we can use one.
They're great. From here, we're going to return something. Again, this is your set state in Redux. We're going to return the state.
Oh, you're on the default line.
Oh, thank you. Too far down. And we're going to take our count, and instead of adding to it, we'll subtract the value from it. And then that should be it. Let's watch this work inside of state. Let's call this.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need
It
to
was
call
wired
it.
to the onClick.
Perfect. Throw this down here. And now it should fire. There we go. Cool. So that's all well and good. We have stuff updating in state, but you may be noticing we're not updating on our page at all, which is not ideal. It's not what we want. Redux is really, really great at managing state. It gets a gold star in that. What it's not good at doing is updating state visually on your browser, on the DOM. That is what React is perfect at. So tomorrow we will go into React Redux, which will update our state for us every time it is updated in the Redux store. So for today, we're going to force this to happen. And I want you to promise me that you will never do this in your actual code, but this is a hacky way to get this to work. So, inside of our app class, we can now get rid of these things. We are going to call store.subscribe. And what this is a method that listens to the store. If there is a change in the store, it will do something in here. So we can say console.log hi. If there is a change in the store, it will console log hi. So we hit add. Not only do we see the console log from our reducer, but we see that this store subscribe console logged hi. So what we're going to do is every time there is a update in the store, we are going to force an update. And what this does is this just forces your components to update. Never use this. I will be very sad if I see this. But again, this is the only way we're going to get this to work on this side without React Redux. So now, every time the store is updated, our DOM is updated. Cool. All right, where are we on time? 3:21. So we're running into almost an hour now. Before I push anything else, is there anything about this that doesn't make sense or you have a question about now? I expect that there's a lot that doesn't make sense. This is a new pattern, a new way of thinking, a new architecture that will just take some getting used to and going through some of the labs. But is there anything that's unclear I can answer now?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So we got the reducer on the app level here, like top level,
Mm-hmm.
and dispatches like down in the children components.
It's funny you should mention that.
Sorry?
It's funny you should mention that. Continue with your question and then I'll answer it if you don't answer it yourself.
Okay. Actually, maybe now that I'm looking at it, maybe, but I know there were different dispatches. Are they all going to one single reducer, or are there cases where there might be different reducers?
So in React Redux, your reducers and actions are abstracted from your components altogether. So this is the only time that these things will be in here. Normally they're in their own file. And there can be many types of reducers, not just this one type of reducer. But your store can only take a single reducer. So there is a special function called combined reducers that will combine all your reducers into one, and then you can pass that mega reducer to your store. So there's a couple ways that we can organize this, but tomorrow when we go over React Redux, we'll talk a little bit about that. I probably won't give an example of combined reducers, but if I remember to, I'll try to code something in. But yeah, so there are many types of actions. They can go to a single reducer or they can go to many reducers. It is better practice to have many reducers. Obviously not like 50 reducers, but like maybe have 5, depending on what the functionality. All the functionality should be linked. So if you have this reducer that is updating states regarding numbers, maybe you want another reducer that's handling comments or something. So you're not having a 50-line switch statement.
Gotcha.
Cool.
So switch statement, kind of like an if-else statement.
Mm-hmm. So this is basically the if kind of part, that it's just identifying, taking a thing, and then these are all the if-elses. This is really the last else is this default, but yeah. So if this action equals rows, or else if it equals decrease, else if default. So it's like a chain of 3 basically.
Would that work as an, just curious, would that work as an if statement? Oh, it would. Okay.
It would. This is just a cleaner, nicer way to do it.
Yeah, sweet.
Any other questions?
Is it important in that case? Is it important the default is at the end? Like if it's at the
Yes.
beginning, will it just hit that automatically without case
Uh,
hidden cases?
I don't think it would even work if you had it at the top. But again, that's not something I've done. I've never tried,
don't
so
do it.
we can see. Let's see what happens.
Okay.
All right. Well, it doesn't break, so I guess it doesn't matter. It might be because the keyword default identifies this as this is just the default. So there you go. Now you know.
I'm just curious about that force update that you did. That despite it being in this component, it just kind of reaches down into a counter component and just changes what's on the screen. It's
Well,
just.
Let's think about which component it's updating.
Uh-huh.
So it's updating app, right?
Right.
And so therefore everything in app is being updated.
Mm-hmm.
So if we did a force update further down and we did it on a lower component, it wouldn't update everything that was in an app. But because this is at the most parent component, it's updating everything that it touches, essentially.
Oh. Okay. Right on. Cool.
Mm. Cool. What other questions do you have? It's weird, I know. But it's super fun, super useful once you get used to it. And after you've cried at least once.
Super cool.
Mm. I think Vue, if you're thinking of new technologies to try to use, I think Vue follows the same sort of pattern. If you are interested in looking in that. Any questions about the actions? Okay. So let's talk about the payload a little bit. Here, these types just triggered something. So let's actually make use of that payload. We have a, should we do this in number with message? Let's do this with our messages. So I'm going to, inside of our message, our increase, I'm going to put back the payload that we had before. And with this payload, what was it? It was added store.getState.value. I would like this string to appear on the screen every time I hit increase. So the way that I'm going to do that is back up inside of our reducer. When we update the state, we are also going to update our message in state, which is right here. So instead of just setting this, we're going to put a comma here, and we're going to select message and say this message is going to equal the action.payload. So that now, every time again, this won't appear on the screen because we haven't put it anywhere, but we still have the state down here, the message is updated in state. So if I want that to appear on my screen someplace, let's call it, say here. We'll do it underneath counter and we'll say store.getState, and we'll say we want it to display message. And now, every time we hit add, the message will appear. So, when we first wrote this out, we were just triggering this action, this logic that was handled here. In this case, we were actually sending a bit of data up with our action. So instead of having to pass it all the way back, up through every single component, we can just attach it to our dispatch, and our dispatch can bring it directly to our reducer. You'll be doing this sort of logic way more than you'll be doing this. So, that being said, let's see how we can utilize that with a form. Now, our number component is a very small input, and it has a props.handle change or change value right now. So we are instead going to create a dispatch for this. We're going to let's get rid of props from here, make it a little cleaner. Define change value. We are going to pass it E, simply because we're going to need it in this case. Since our input has the value that we are looking for. So when I do my store.dispatch, I have to, this is left over, but you need to import store in order to have access to it. I'm going to set my type to set value. Needs to be in the string. And for my payload, I'm going to put the event.target.value inside of my payload so that my value from my input is being sent to my dispatch on change. This is being sent to my reducer, so I will need to make a new case for my reducer, which will be set value. And on receiving set value, we will update state. We will make a copy of our current state, and we will select our value, and our value will be the action.payload we passed it, so that when we increase our value here, it will update in state. And now I can add by 5. Before I move on to the problem that this created, does anything about grabbing the value from our form and sending it up to our reducer not check out and not make sense? Hearing... yeah? Okay.
I had a question.
Go for it.
Maybe looking for clarification. In online 6, we're doing store.dispatch.
Mm-hmm.
Store is defined on app level. We
required it in up here. I just forgot to erase it, so it was already required in here.
Okay, and that's actually pulling the what we created it in the app with the as a reducer. Oh, create store with the reducer. Okay.
Exactly.
Cool.
Hey, John, is your image a picture, a screenshot of you on... Yeah, it is. The entire time I thought you had your video on, and then I just realized you weren't moving. You can turn your video off, that's fine. Okay, cool.
Oh my god.
Just noticed that. Anyways, yeah, so that's, you're right. The story comes from here. That's a great clarification because it's easy to forget. It comes from being created here and the reducer here. Anything else about this that doesn't make sense? Okay, cool. So this has nothing to do with Redux, what's going on here. So why is this happening? That's working.
Looks like we're just concatenating 5 onto it.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think that's happening? Let's take a look at what we have here. Inside of rows.
Set of rows. Count as an integer. State that values also an integer.
Is it?
No, it's a string.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. We can see it in state here. So
Can we just plus instead?
well, the value is a specific number, right? So we want to make sure that we are equaling to the value. So we're going to need to do parseInt in it. If you haven't seen it yet, parseInt is a method in JavaScript that changes our strings to numbers. It is our toInt for JavaScript. So we will parseInt this, and we should be able to now do this without a problem. don't know why minus is working. That weirds me out, but adding is not working.
At
So
what point
concatenating.
does it become a string?
It becomes a string because it's coming from our input. So
Oh,
our
okay.
input's not a number. It is giving us a string since it's coming from the form.
Gotcha.
Form quotes. All right. And that is Redux. Enjoy doing the labs. If you have any questions about them, let me know. Again, we're missing about half of Redux right now, and that is React Redux. We will go over tomorrow. But other than that, we'll end this here. I will stop recording. If there's any other questions, throw them at me.